approach was a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. So these are people who either were incompetent to stand trial or declared insane by the courts. So it's has much more security to it than most hospitals even then did. But it's not atypical for what hospitals were like. It's pretty shocking. But if you can find a way to get it and see it, I would, if you want to know what this is really about, that's what it's about. So it's kind of the worst case scenario, but you have to, there were a lot of places like that.
So what exactly is the difference between like someone who's criminally insane and just someone who has a mental illness?
So criminal insanity has nothing to do with the illness. It has to do with the fact that you're a criminal and you're ill. So there are really two different models. One is what's referred to as the insanity defense. So you essentially say, I'm not guilty because I did it while I was insane. Depending on the state, but in Pennsylvania, that's very difficult to prove. What the courts will do here often is declare you guilty, but mentally ill. So when you go to prison, you go to a special psychiatric unit, and your sentence may be a little bit less because you're ill. But you don't get off from your illness. Now, it's possible, but you have to be really insane. I mean, I forget, the number of insanity defenses in Pennsylvania that work are like 1%. So almost everybody who you would think about as mentally ill, having done a crime, a serious crime, will get declared guilty but mentally ill. And so they get a prison term, but they may spend most of that in a hospital-like setting, but locked up, just like.
Okay, I guess we'll just start from our first question.
Try your questions and I'll.
Okay, so number one, what exactly is mental illness?
That's a really good question. There are kind of three versions of the answer to that. One is that it is most often an illness that is a mix of genetics, chemistry, and environment. And that ranges from relatively minor ones like minor depression and anxiety disorders to things like schizophrenia and manic depressive illness. It also depends a little bit on your culture. So what may be seen as mental illness in Philadelphia and what may be seen as mental illness in China or Kenya will be somewhat different. It's not that there isn't that perception, but there may be kind of different layers to it. A lot of what we know about mental illness now, we didn't know 50 years ago. So if there's one part of medicine that has gotten more and more sophisticated very fast, it's psychiatry. So most of the things we thought were almost entirely environmental. I mean, if you go back far enough, like the 1800s here, almost everybody believed everything was genetic. So mental illness was genetic, and that's why even if you were the child of somebody with a serious mental illness, everybody assumed you were going to be crazy too, and they treated you like that. So there's a history of people getting hospitalized even then they weren't crazy because they were the sons and daughters. Then that all switched for a while, and it became quite popularized primarily by Freud and the analysts, Sigmund Freud, that these were all environmental and child-rearing problems. And starting in the late 50s, 60s, people started to understand that they were both. So you can have genetic loadings for an illness, in your family, that doesn't mean you're going to get it. So even the most serious, like schizophrenia, even if you have two parents with schizophrenia, your odds of getting it are less than 25%. So it gives you a flavor that it's partly genetic, but lots of people don't get it. And if you only have one parent, the odds are lower. So even in identical twins, it's still less than 50%, where they have exactly the same genes. So it's some kind of mixture of environment and temperament and all kinds of other things.
Do you want to check the audio?
Okay.
Okay, so that ties into our second question. Which groups, like age, sex, or socioeconomic class, are most likely to experience or develop mental illnesses?
So it depends on how you ask the question, actually. So poor people have higher rates of diagnosable mental illness. There's a lot of argument in the literature about whether or not that's a function of their mental illness, so that they're poor, and that's partially true, or that being poor increases your risk because of all the stress that goes with it and the family difficulties that do. And it's probably both. When you get into different diagnoses, you get different questions. So depression is more common among women over a lifetime prevalence, what's called lifetime prevalence, as opposed to today. So if we did, one of the interesting things about mental illness, if you do what's called epidemiology studies, where you're trying to find out how much there is, if you do it just one day for everybody, you get one number. And if you do it lifetime, you get a different number. Because many of these illnesses come and go and are better and worse. So almost everything, like even schizophrenia and manic depressive illness, anxiety disorders, depression, get worse and better. And you meet people that had very serious illnesses when they were 22 or 60 and have had only one other episode their whole lives. So there's a lot of come and go with it. Particularly if you have mild symptoms. There are people who have mild symptoms their whole lives, never get treated, just learn to live with it.
Okay. Number 3, what are the different types of mental illnesses?
There's a whole long list of diagnostic categories, but in general, policy people like myself think about categories of people mostly having to do with how much care they need. So there's a subset of people, which is probably between 2 and 3%, who have serious chronic psychiatric difficulties. Usually patients with schizophrenia and manic depressive disorders, but what now called bipolar, mostly because they have higher rates of reoccurrence. And they need more care. They need more support. They need more treatment. There's the largest group are really people who have relatively mild and generally quite treatable anxiety, depression, and a variety of other phobic disorders, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And those are not as chronic, nor as severe. And so they need less long-term care, more kind of episodic care here or there or another time over the course of years. And we've gotten to know a lot more about the quality treatment for that. So today there's a lot of emphasis on what's referred to as evidence-based treatment. So evidence-based treatment is treatment that gets done because there's a very specific evidence base that says if you do this, with people that these characteristics and this diagnosis, a percentage, 70 or so percent of them will get better. And so if you apply the evidence base, most of the time, it's going to work. Now that's not I mean, it's interesting, that's not how people think about medicine generally, but that's exactly what medicine does. I mean, not everything works. So even antibiotics, which are probably the simplest thing doctors do, don't work for everybody. Now the number they don't work for is small, but it's clearly there. And so increasingly, both in medicine in general, but in psychiatry and in health services, people are increasingly emphasizing evidence-based. Probably the best example of that is cognitive behavioral therapy, what people refer to as CBT. CBT is a method of psychotherapy actually developed by a guy here in Philadelphia, believe it or not, who's still alive, whose name is Aaron Beck. Dr. Beck developed this model of psychotherapy. It's basically taking over the psychotherapy world. And it's a model of psychotherapy where it's relatively brief, 8 to 10 sessions, even if you're pretty serious, and even if you're more serious, maybe 20 sessions. And it's really designed to reduce your symptomatology. Lots of really good studies show how effective it is. And Tim is now 93 and still living here in Philadelphia and sort of working as much as he can work. Pretty amazing character.
Okay, so I think you basically answered number 6. What are some common procedures we use today to cure mental illnesses?
The other one obviously
else?
is pharmacology. So there are now a lot of really effective drugs that no one had before. So until the 1950s, there were no effective psychopharmacology. In other words, there were no drugs that really worked. So there's no such thing as antidepressants. There's no such thing as anti-anxiety drugs. There's no real treatment for schizophrenia or for bipolar disease. So what you have to imagine is these hospitals that you read about and the kind of chaos of them and the cruelty of them. A big part of that was that there was no effective treatment. And so people spent years there untreated, basically. And untreated psychoses are not pretty. And so part of this history of these big institutions with lots of very crazy people has partly to do with the institutions and partly to do with the fact that we had no good treatment. So people tried all kinds of things like electroshock and brain surgery and I mean all these crazy things. You think what the hell did they think they were doing? And they used to do what were called baths, which were really just strapping people in tubs with cold water. I mean, it sounds completely loony today, but they didn't have a drug to use. They were trying anything they could think of to be able to manage patients and make them somewhat better.
You're basically answering everything before I ask them. That was number 4. What are the key differences between today's mental hospitals and the mental hospitals of the past?
So I would tell you that this is the best description of what they were like. So you have to remember where mental hospitals come from. So mental hospitals are really outgrowth institutions of poorhouses. So I don't know if you know anything about poorhouses. So poorhouses were the first care institutions, both in the UK and here. Since we were basically an English culture, we kind of adopted all the crazy things the English did. So poorhouses were places where anybody who was feeble-minded, which meant mentally retarded, or demented, who now would be in a nursing home or in some other kind of care facility, anybody who had serious mental illness, anybody who couldn't pay their debts, anybody who was arrested for various and sundry vice crimes like prostitution and other things, and if you were gay, you all ended up there. And the most famous one of them is where the word bedlam comes from. You know, the word bedlam. Bedlam means like all this noise and craziness going on at the same time. People will say, I went to this party and it was bedlam. Well, Bedlam is actually the name of a big poorhouse on the banks of the Thames River in London. And the Dons, the rich English people, used to go in their carriages and sit up on the bank and throw little coins and things into the hospital and have everybody scramble for them. It was like, I think it was like pro football today in England at the time. But, you know, it's the same kind of quality to it. But anyway, that's where the word comes from. And so what we think about as state hospitals here in the 40s and 50s and 30s and actually into the 60s and early 70s were really the newest version of those places. So those places eventually kind of split up into pieces. So you get institutions for mentally retarded, institutions for mentally ill, nursing homes, and you didn't go to prison for your debts anymore. You just went bankrupt. But those were, that's how it all started, was in these poorhouses. And the most famous one in Philadelphia was a place called Blockley Hall. The name still exists on a building here in Penn. And it was right where the, you know where the, I don't know if you know how well you know Penn, but there's the Perlman Center, right along the river. Right, there used to be the convention center, which is now downtown, used to be right there, right across from HUP. And all those new buildings along those glass towers, they're all built on the poorhouse site, which was called Blockley Hall. And then it was and that emerged, that disappeared, and it became Philadelphia General Hospital, which was a city hospital that was there for many years. So these hospitals that people always talk about as the way we cared were pretty amazing places. They were entirely self-contained villages. Some of them were the size of small cities. I mean, there's some in New York State that had 6,000 patients. So they had everything. Mm-hmm. They grew their own food, had their own bakeries, everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't exactly, you can continue it. Do you have it? Do you have the questions? Okay. If you don't have it, I can like write it down. Do you have it?
It has to open.
Okay. Anyway. Yeah, there was another one, but it wasn't for mental illness. It was for, it starts with a T.
Where in? Do you know where?
BuzzFeed did a video on it. What's it called? No. I don't know. It was famous for a body shoot. And like, when you were saying they had their own farms, like, they had their own farms too, but like a lot of people starved to death, and it was also famous for like being haunted. I forget the name.
I don't know what that is. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of these big old places. There were like, if you count both MR and MH in Pennsylvania, there were 50-some of them here at one time. There are about 3 left. One of the few, Norristown is one of the few left. Mm-hmm. In Pennsylvania, and it's only got 200 patients left in it. It used to have a couple thousand, and mostly who's there now are forensic patients, meaning people who are there because they're court involved from a crime. So it's not people just with mental illness, it's people also with court involvement.
Okay, I think another one of our questions was, were human experiments ever performed on the people, like without their consent, and like that's not related to their illness?
Yes. There have been a number of scandals about that in different states in the 50s and early 60s. I don't remember the cases specifically very much, but there were a number of vaccine trials that were done in state hospital patients without consent. It was the same period when they were doing it in prisons. Researchers, including some from here, got in trouble for doing it in the city jails here years ago. But it was pretty typical research to be done that way. They didn't perceive these people as having real rights. And it's only in the 1970s when that whole question about people's rights got into the courts, and the courts ruled emphatically that they did. And so almost all the state laws had to change, and a lot of what they actually did with people had to change. So there's really a revolution in those places in some ways in the early 70s, mostly because of court intervention.
Okay. So I guess now we're moving on to more modern things. This is still in the past. What was the daily routine like working at a mental hospital? You could either answer like for today or in the past or whatever you want.
What's it like? Well, let's talk about what it's like now. So, almost all what you think about as mental hospitals, there aren't very many of them. And they tend to be small. And they're almost all acute, which means patients only stay a week or 10 days. So the average length of stay in acute psychiatric hospitals, which is what most of them are, is around 12 days. And that's for people with pretty serious illnesses. You don't get admitted for a minor depression. Nobody will admit you, nobody will pay for you. You get to go home and get treatment. So the hospital bed thing is used so much less than it used to be. The vast majority of people who get treated for mental illness are never in a bed for any overnight stay of any kind. In Philadelphia, for example, in the public system, even the private insurance side, there are about 700, let's just take Medicaid. So Medicaid covers almost 700,000 people in Philadelphia, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. And of those 700,000 people, about 10 or 12% of them every year get some mental health treatment. And of the people who get treated, less than 1.5% of them actually are in a bed ever in that year. So we're talking about a relatively very tiny number. So what it's like to be in those units, to work in those units now, is in some ways probably a lot harder than it was at a state hospital, where you had people who stayed 12 years and 5 years and a year, because patients come and go pretty quickly. So you have to be able to work them up, figure out what's wrong, start them on the right treatment, make connections to their family and where they're going to go after care, all of those things really quickly. So the units, the inpatient units, are staffed much more than they were in the 50s and 60s, more people. But they're also very high turnover. And so it's a tough job that way, because you're constantly, every day there are new people, new patients. So when you go in the morning, some of the people you saw that afternoon before are gone, and there are new people there. So in some ways, some people find it exciting and interesting and lively, and other people find it makes them insane. It's like emergency rooms. It takes a particular kind of person to do that. So it's not as speedy as emergency rooms, but it's still pretty quick. I mean, if you worked in a state hospital in the 50s or 40s, you probably lived there too. Probably lived on the grounds.
So patients in the past, they usually stay there a lot longer than 10 to 12 days.
Yes, much longer.
Would most of them stay there until they die, or like how would they get taken out?
Most I think it's overstatement to say most of them stay until they die, but large numbers did. I mean, it was typical when I first came into graduate school at a state hospital, in the VA hospital, to find people that had been there 25 years with no prospect of leaving. And I mean, even I knew when I was, I was 22 years old, even I knew they weren't that ill. You know, and when the kind of deinstitutionalization that people talk about came, a lot of the first thousands of people that came out were those people who had been there way too long, and their functioning, their ability to do things and take care of themselves wasn't degraded so much by their illness as it was by being in an institution that long. I mean, it's the same thing if you're in prison for 40 years. It has the same kind of effect. I mean, my favorite story is about a guy who I used to run a psychiatric emergency room in Pittsburgh years ago. And I went in one day, and then one of the nurses who worked for me came up and said that she wanted me to see this patient because it was so unusual. I said, okay. And when you're in an emergency room, there aren't many of that unusual things anymore, especially a psychiatric emergency room. So I go to see this guy. He's about 50, 60 years old. Little, but not little. Looks like he's dressed in khakis and a shirt and work boots. It doesn't look like anybody, it doesn't look like anybody else. And he's there because he's run out of his medicine. And it turns out he was discharged from a state forensic hospital 3 months before, where he had been for 26 years. And he was there because he had gotten in a fight with some guy. That he was a hobo. You know what a hobo is? He was a hobo. He got in a fight with some guy who essentially got killed in the fight. He went to jail. They declared him, quote, insane, sent him off to this place. I don't know if he ever was insane, but he certainly wasn't insane when we saw him. And he was worried about his medicine. And he had 2 pills left. And the nurse couldn't figure out what they were. So in those days, you had to look them up in a book and see if you could figure out what they were by looking at, in a book. They weren't in the book. So the nurse, being a nurse, did something I would have never done, which is she broke one apart, took a little taste of it. And she said, "That's a Tums." This guy had been on Tums at least for the last 10 years. He didn't know what they were. He was taking them every day because they told him to. And he thought it had to do with his illness. So we decided we wouldn't tell him the exact truth because we thought it'd be way too much for him to deal with that day. And so we told him how he could get more of them. And we gave him a few dollars to go get more. And told him to come back in a few days, and we talked to him again. He dutifully did. And he had gotten rolls of Tums. And he kept taking them. As long as I knew him, he kept taking them. I mean, if he believed they kept him sane, there wasn't any reason to disabuse him of the notion. But can you imagine ended up your whole life kind of ruined? That happened to a lot of people. Anyway,
Yeah, you just answered 2 of our questions again.
Oh, good.
It was, how do you think mental hospitals affected? No, that's not it. Do you think mental hospitals are effective in curing mental illnesses? And do you have any stories with patients you've worked with?
I have lots of stories.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if I can give you a couple of good stories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things that you come to realize when you do this long enough is that there are really varying perceptions of what is mental illness and what's acceptable in different places. This is another ER story. So I went into the ER one day, and there are in the waiting room, there are 3 guys sitting together, and 2 of them are wearing capes and cowls. You know what a cowl is? And the cowl has like a red thing on top. And these are big black capes, big black boots, and this cowl. And the guy between them has a plaid shirt and khakis and work boots on. And he looks perfectly normal. And I walk into my office, and the nurses come running in, and they say, "You got to see this." And I say, "What? The 2 guys in the cowls?" They said, "No, they brought in the crazy guy." So these 2 guys were on their way to a Wickham convention somewhere, which is a witches thing, in their outfits, on the turnpike. Found this poor wandering guy running around, not speaking any discernible language, really psychotic. Decided he needed care and put him in their car and drove him to our emergency room because they were worried about him. And after we found out, we interviewed him, we knew he needed to stay, and we couldn't, eventually we got a name out of his pocket so we could try to find his family, and we did. But we thanked the 2 guys in the cowls, and they left. And I have to tell you, if you'd asked me who was mentally ill when I walked in that waiting room, it would not have been that guy. So it's what you perceive as being ill. And so there are lots of things, people with symptoms out there in the world who function pretty well and have various symptoms and symptoms. I mean, everybody has a story about the crazy uncle in their family and stuff. There's always a crazy uncle or a crazy cousin, or and you know, whether or not it's seen as a mental illness and something that should be treated or not varies by culture and family and all kinds of other things.
So this is one of our last questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think mental illnesses are taken too lightly in the United States today?
You know, I think, I don't think people understand how much it affects other people and the economy. And so I think the resources they get compared to the rest of medicine, for example, compared to the amount of money we spend on cancer or on heart disease, isn't enough. I'm not necessarily arguing that we spend less on cancer, but maybe. So what we know about treating cancer is a lot less than what we know about treating mental illnesses. But we're going to get money. If you have cancer, you get almost any treatment on the history of the world from somebody. And if you have mental illness, you may or may not, and particularly if you're poor. And so, in that sense, I don't think we take it seriously enough. I will say that in my lifetime, the stigma of being mentally ill is dramatically changed. Now, not everybody would tell you that there's still stigma, but it's nothing like it used to be. I mean, every other day there's some celebrity talking about having depression or something, or addiction, or, I mean, it's just, I mean, if you were a celebrity when I was growing up, saying that was the end of your career. Now it's the mark of, it's some kind of badge of honor that you have something wrong with you. And it makes you more exciting on Twitter and Facebook. And, you know what I mean? It does. But compared to when I was growing up, that would never happen. In that sense, I think that's a good thing, I think, generally. But I still think it's under-resourced.
Okay, so millions of Americans are affected by mental health problems a year, and it says 1 in 5 adults experience mental illness in a given year, and 1 in 5 teenagers experience a severe mental disorder in some point during their life. But what we don't really understand is 1 in 5 teenagers, but then it says in some point during their life.
Right.
So teenagers.
So people would get epidemiology all screwed up. So there's 2 kinds of epi numbers that people use. There's what's called prevalence, and there's lifetime prevalence. And prevalence means, or incidence is what incidence prevalence. Incident really means if we actually interviewed everybody, the people in this room today, this percentage of them would have diagnosable symptoms. And prevalence really has to do with a lifetime. So because mental illnesses get better and worse and come and go, lifetime prevalence may be quite different than today, one-day incidents. My always example I always use when I teach is it's kind of like Miami. So everybody in Miami is born Hispanic, and they seem to die Jewish because all the babies and the vast majority of the babies in Miami are born Hispanic, Cuban. And most of the deaths are old Jews from New York who have moved to Miami. So if you just look, if you don't think about today versus lifetime, you would think everybody was born Hispanic and they end up dying Jewish, but that's not true. So this is the difference between what people talk about as cross-sectional and longitudinal. So prevalence, think about as longitudinal. So the 1 in 5 number that people throw around for current, none of us in the business believe. It is probably true that something like 1 in 8 or 10 have some symptom, but are they really diagnosable? Probably not. It's probably more like 1 in 15 that really diagnosable. Now, if you told me that over the lifetime, over somebody's lifetime, that number might rise to 20%, where somebody in some point in their life had a diagnosable episode, I think that's probably not bad. Almost, I mean, if you just, when you get to be 40 and you look around the room of your really close friends, some pretty substantial number of them will have had some period in their life related often to external events, deaths or divorce or something happened to their children. I mean, all of those things can throw people into depression and anxiety disorders. Happens to a lot of people.
Okay, so we're at the end of our interview,
Oh, you're welcome.
and is there anything you would like to say or mention, like where to get help or when to get help?
When to get help's really hard. I think it's particularly hard with teenagers. And I think that's true because teenagers' emotional balance comes and goes really fast. And you probably know this from your own experience. You're going to have really awful days and pretty good days very close together. And so I think parents have a difficult time not overreacting to those 2 bad days in a row. And on the other hand, then they don't necessarily react when you really should react, when you have 15 of those in a row. So I think it's particularly tough with adolescents. One of the things that I've come to believe in more and more in my career is what I call peer support. So one of the things we do now in the adult mental health system particularly is we've developed this whole network of things called peer supports. So if you're coming down with a serious mental illness, one of the things we try to do is get you a peer, and that's somebody, in other words, somebody roughly your age who's had the same experience. And then we call it learned life experience. One of the things we do a lot of now is try to get those people to connect with people who are experiencing mental illness for the first time, who can react the way they react and know what they're feeling and how difficult it is. And I think they're probably better at interpreting the treatment system to the client, to the patient, than we are, and can be very helpful. I'd like to see more of that done with adolescents, because I think if there was a safe place to go with other adolescents when you're not doing well, it might get used more than reaching out to treatment, if you know what I mean. And there's now some of that on college campuses. So, for example, Penn, there's a student group called Live Life, which is a bunch of students who basically have gotten some training and who kind of form this support group for students who experience symptoms. And they're basically just there to support. And if you want to get treatment, they'll help you get it. But I think that's the kind of stuff that would be useful, particularly with high school kids. I wish you luck. What else are you doing for this, other than this interview?
We've reached out to other people.
No luck?
You're the only professor who
Who did you reach out to?
We decided to do a couple other professors from UPenn. I think one from Temple, the Pennsylvania hospital, who just emailed me today about someone who we're going to interview next week.
Who's that? Do you remember?